let's just talk about and set the stage for Jamaica's 1831 revolt against slavery. Place us in that time period, if you could, between the Haitian Revolution and the Civil War. How ubiquitous was slavery in Jamaica at the time? I mean, I think I read in your book 9 out of every 10 Jamaicans were enslaved. So that's an incredible figure. Just give us some broader context and then we can begin to narrow things down.
Sure. At that point, British slavery was in its 330th year. It was a lasting and extremely profitable institution for the empire. They raised sugar as a monoculture. That is to say, that was really the only thing going on in Jamaica, was the production of this nutritionally worthless product, which nevertheless fueled an addiction back in the mother country. And in order to raise it, required this unspeakably cruel institution, which was multi-generational in nature, which required fear and torture to sustain it. And what had happened was that missionaries, Christian missionaries from the mother country, Baptists and Methodists primarily, had finally gained entrance to what were called the Sugar Islands and began to spread the dangerous message that people can be free. People can be free in a spiritual sense. And this bled over into a more political message that we can be free in a material sense.
And I want to touch on that because that was an incredible dynamic that you laid out. But let's back up a little bit to talking about how the British seized Jamaica in the first place in the 1600s and how that kind of set up an economy and an infrastructure for what we saw 200 years later.
Sure. When Britain deposed its king and appointed Oliver Cromwell the Lord Protectorate, he had an aggressive foreign policy, in particular something that he called the Western design. Comparisons with the modern day are always, tricky, but this might be compared to the U.S. going into Iraq. This was this patriotic thing that we're going to seize the Caribbean islands from the Spanish. And the seizure of Jamaica was kind of a comic opera. Nothing went right, but they stumbled into a military victory and claimed what happened to have been, for them, one of the most profitable islands in the Caribbean. And that was where you really saw slavery ramped up into a commodity level concern.
So, I mean, there were the twin, I guess, commodities of slavery and the role that Jamaica played in that, which I want to ask you about, and sugar. Would you say those were the two primary fundamental economic drivers in Jamaica for Great Britain?
No question. Those were the twin foundations of the economy.
And so then talk a little bit more about the slave trade and Jamaica's role in the slave trade.
Sure. Jamaica was what was known as the slave depot of the Caribbean. That is to say that kidnapped human beings from Africa were taken primarily first to Jamaica and then traded throughout the rest of the British possessions in North America, what would eventually become the United States among them. And so the harbor at Kingston and Port Royal was the first site of the New World that a newly enslaved person was going to see. And, there are reports, really vivid, heartbreaking reports of a kind of a catatonia that would descend upon those who were entering a horrific new life at that point. They had already survived the Middle Passage, and what they saw in front of them was this riotous explosion of verdure, the whips, gangs, this new language. Many enslaved people were afraid that the white people were going to drink their blood. It brought a sense of overwhelming depression, quite understandably so, among those who were exposed to this atrocity.
Well, I mean, your first chapter of your book describes Jamaica as the suburb of hell, which, given the description of the heat, of the brutality, of the frequency with which slaves would be killed within years of them arriving and being brutally forced into labor, of course, for years until they were seen as too old or too useless, not even allowed to breed because it was cheaper to import slaves. I guess just if you could emphasize and talk about some of the practices that made it so brutal, specifically in Jamaica.
Sure. You mentioned a suburb of hell, and that's what some folks in Britain were calling Jamaica. Actually, there was never a unified enthusiasm back in the mother country for this practice. There were jokes, for example, about the bricks of the city of Liverpool, which was Britain's greatest slave trading brokerage city, that those bricks were sealed with men's blood. The image of a West Indian trader, which was, of course, a euphemism for slaveholder, becoming a person of obnoxious, vulgar wealth. That was a stereotype. And there's a lot of truth to it, throughout British society, that these folks who had profited from this atrocity were ridiculously wealthy, gold-plated coaches, more wealth than the British monarchy. Jamaica itself was regarded as kind of a Wild West, a place where statistics showed that if you were a young white man going, and they were almost all men, going to make their fortune in this atmosphere, that you would have an income that was 57 times that of one of your compatriots who had gone to New England.
Wow.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
a bit of a new money dynamic, right? Where
correct.
it's seen as gaudy, seen as ostentatious, and of a lower brow as well.
Correct. I mean, again, a rough comparison, not completely accurate, but you might think of the way that a well-bred Bostonian of the early 20th century might look at an oil tycoon from Texas. Great wealth, but the perception of a lack of breeding, a lack of in morality for many Britons who were never quite comfortable with the enslavement of kidnapped human beings.
Right, right. It was not genteel, I guess. And you mentioned Cromwell earlier. I wanted to ask, and of course the English Civil War. What was a difference that you observed, or that there was, between British imperialism under Charles I versus under Cromwell after he took over?
Sure, that was a brief period of exuberance and of jingoism in British foreign policy. And the shape of the Caribbean today can be largely attributed to the consequential events, in that decade, where who was going to be the colonial masters of what island was shaken out.
Folks, there's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.